Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Genomics Lite. So tonight is our third in our cancer research series, and we're joined by Dr. Alastair Droop to look at machine learning, artificial intelligence, and how that's used in cancer and healthcare. So I think a lot of you have joined us for these this evening before, but if it's your first time, then welcome along to the series. I will share my screen again and tell you a little bit about how the event's going to run tonight. So all of our events are aimed to help everyone explore what science of genomics means for all of our lives. So we encourage you to join in and participate in tonight's event, but we all ask that you do so respectfully and in a spirit of curiosity. Myself and Fran will be here this evening to moderate the platform and make sure it's an inclusive space for everybody. If you've not used Zoom webinar before, you'll have spotted you can't use your camera or your microphone this evening. So if you want to get in touch with us, if you want to just say hi, if you want to answer any question that Alastair's asking, or if you've got any technical issues, you can use the chat box below to let us know anything like that. If you have questions for Alastair about his work or anything he's talking about tonight, use the Q&A box to submit your questions. That makes it just a bit easier for us to find them as we're going through the talk. We've also got closed captions available this evening, so you can press the CC box and they should jump up on the screen. If they're in the way, if you don't want them, you can also hide them, but they're there if you need to. We'll also be using polls this evening, so they'll jump up on your screen and ask you a multiple choice question. I know that if you're on mobile, sometimes polls are hard to see, so you can use the chat box to tell us your thoughts if you can't get the polls working. This is the third in the cancer research series. The previous two are both available to watch back on our website and our YouTube channel. And our event next week will look at careers in cancer research. So if you're interested in potentially going into a career in cancer research, come along to that because we'll be hearing from a few different researchers how they got into the field. Lastly, so all three of us would in normal times be based at the Wellcome Genome campus. Obviously, we are not there right now. We are all working from home. The Wellcome Genome campus is based just south of Cambridge, and all the work that we do has something to do with this genome word, all to do with DNA. So it'd be really nice to know where in the world everyone is joining us from this evening. So if you would like to pop in the chat box where you are joining us this evening, I'd like to see how far away from campus we have got to. So Alastair is joining us from York. Me and Fran are near Cambridge. We've got Kent, Yorkshire, Norwich, so quite local, quite a lot from London. India, I think, is definitely the furthest away so far, but welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening. So on the campus, we've got two main research institutes. We've got the Wellcome Sanger Institute and we've got EMBL EBI. The Wellcome Sanger Institute uses what we would call wet lab techniques, so things like pipettes, microscopes, that sort of thing that you might have seen, as well as data science. So EMBL EBI, the other big research institute on campus, only uses data science. It doesn't do any wet lab stuff, but everything that we do has something to do with that genome, that DNA. We have lots of different areas of research, from human genetics, looking at how diseases are passed down, cancer, which obviously is a topic of this series, cells and how different cells are different from each other, parasites and microbes, that is mainly malaria focused and right now is very COVID focused, as you can imagine. The Tree of Life project, which is looking at biodiversity and biodata, using all of that data that we get from biology experiments to understand health and genomics. If anyone's interested in our sort of COVID areas, we've got some events coming up for that I'll put some information in the chat box in a minute. For anyone who is studying for GCSEs, A-levels, or even at university or college, a couple of things that might be of use to you. So first, we have our Your Genome website, which is full of activities, resources, videos, all sorts of stuff like that, all around DNA and genomics that might be useful to you. And if you sign up to our mailing list, we update when we've got new content, and we'll let you know when we're doing new series like this. Other events that might be of interest to you include our new COVID Connections series. The first one of that was last night and will also be available online shortly. And there's 3 more in the series that'll be across the rest of the year, exploring genomics and coronavirus. And we've also got a team on the I'm a Scientist, Get Me Out of Here platform around the Darwin Tree of Life, where you can do live Q&As with scientists. All the information for this I'll pop in the chat box and will also be on the email that you get tomorrow following up from this event. So I think that's finally all from me. So I will stop sharing my screen. I will pass over to Alastair to tell us more about machine learning in cancer.
Good afternoon. So I'm Alastair Droop. Hi. I'm a bioinformatician working at the Sanger Institute. I work in the cancer genetics group, which means that we use genetic information from patients' DNA to attempt to understand cancer and hopefully to treat it. I would like to give you a very brief outline today of what machine learning is and how we might apply it to cancer and cancer treatment, and then to go on and give you 5 ethical concerns with this that I hope we can think about together. Right, so the first question for you, 2 questions, sorry. Have you heard of machine learning? And if you have you ever thought about its ethical implications? So I hope Emma's put a poll. Have a think about that. We'll give you just a couple of seconds to have a thought about that.
So we've got quite a mix. It's pretty evenly spread. So some people that have not heard much about it and not really thought about the ethical considerations, some that have heard a bit about machine learning but not considered the ethical implications, and some, luckily, that have heard about it and have considered the ethical implications.
Excellent. I hope by the end of this half hour, you will all realize that we do, as a society, as scientists, as students, we have to think about this. What we come up with, I've got no answers for you, but we've got to have that discussion. Before we go any further, I want to just get a couple of terms sorted. So we're going to talk about artificial intelligence, and that's a really broad concept. And here, it simply means any computer program, any algorithm that we might think of as smart. Now that's really open. I know that's open. That's the joy of it. Machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence where we aim to create computer programs that can improve their performance based on the data they see. Right. So now I have to get this to work. Imagine we have a whole load of patients, and each patient either has cancer or does not have cancer. And we have measured 2 genes in these patients. They're called G1 and G2. So now we're going to plot those genes, because there's just 2 of them. We can plot their expression, how highly those genes are expressed, as a graph, as a scatter plot here on the left. Now, some of these patients have cancer and some do not. If you look up at the top there, we can see that one place on this graph has all of the patients that have cancer in it, and one has all of the patients that don't, the blue ones. So we can define a simple way of saying which patients have cancer, and more importantly, here is a new patient. Can I use this algorithm I've just created to say if this new patient has cancer or does not? And as you can see, this is a 2-step process. We take a whole load of patients we know about, we know their cancer status, we plot this graph, we work out from this graph how we are going to decide if a new point has cancer or does not. Then we can assign a cancer diagnosis. You've got cancer, you don't have cancer. to any new patient that comes along. This is machine learning. So there's loads of ways we can do this. The most simple way is the one at the top. We plot this and we draw two circles. One circle is you've got cancer. One circle is you don't have cancer. And in these data, that works incredibly well. We might do the technique at the lower diagram there, where we group every single patient by how far apart they are in this plot, and we see how many different groups fall out, and we can use those groups to assign. So if our data are really simple, we can use really simple machine learning techniques. Now, you probably know by now, we have more than 2 genes in us. We've got, let's call it 16,000 genes that we look at. So our data in biology, particularly in cancer research, is not that simple. Furthermore, we often aren't just looking at genes. Maybe we've got these 16,000 genes to look at, but we also need to know if you smoke and your life history and how old you are and your sex and loads of other things. And at this point, we can't even draw that graph in order to put the groups on, let alone understand how to create these two simple categories. So have a look at this new plot here. Again, we've got a set of patients in blue who do not have cancer and a set of patients in red who do. So can we use those previous two methods, just draw a circle around these data? If so, why not? And if we can, how so? Again, a couple of moments to think about that.
Have you got any ideas for this one? If you pop them in the chat box and I'll read out some answers for Alastair.
I don't want to take too long on this, but just any thoughts you've got, stick them in.
Someone said, no, the data doesn't have a clear correlation. Someone said it might be less accurate. There might be more outliers. Someone said you might be able to see trends, but they didn't seem super sure about it.
You're all right.
Yeah.
All of you are perfectly correct. You could imagine creating some complicated mathematical thing where you could classify these using the simple techniques. This, however, is a really contrived example. It's dead simple, and already it's getting really difficult. So we need another set of techniques when we actually go to real data. And one of those techniques is neural networks, particularly what you might have heard of as deep neural networks, which is what we're going to actually be talking about for the rest of this. So when we have a deep neural network, we take loads of data and we build some mathematical object that describes our data. We feed it loads of training data, and then using this trained model, we feed it new data and it tells us whether it's cancer or not. So, in essence, a neural network is made up of this mathematical thing called a perceptron. That's the image in the bottom left. Now, a perceptron takes a whole load of inputs. Each input is simply a number, and it multiplies each of those inputs by a corresponding weight, and it adds them up. And if that sum gets over a particular threshold, it gives a result. Otherwise, it gives 0. It's that simple. Neural networks are simply adding up. Okay, it's a lot of adding up. So we might have 3 inputs into this perceptron, and it has therefore 3 associated weights. In a deep neural network, we usually have these perceptrons set up in layers. So there is an input layer where its inputs are the data we get from the real world. Then the first layer gets its inputs from the layer before it, the input layer, and it outputs to a second hidden layer, a third, multiple hidden layers. And finally, we have an output layer which gets its inputs from the last hidden layer and gives some prediction out. All we do is tweak the weights. So as you can see, we've got lots of possible weights, and all we do is adjust them until we get the behavior we want. So I took these data, and I trained a deep neural network with 2 hidden layers and 50 nodes.
You just had a really good question that is from your last slide, asking what would be an example of an input.
So in this example right here, we have 2 input nodes, and each input node is the expression of a gene. So it might be that the node is simply how much of this gene is expressed. It might be the patient's age in years at diagnosis. It might be, have they ever smoked? Yes or no. It might be loads of things like that, their BMI, their socioeconomic status. We'll come back to that one later. Loads of different things. The joy of a neural network is you can combine all of these different types of input into one. As you can see here, when I train this little toy network, it does a pretty good job. We have a problem though. We don't control what the network learns. So it is crucial that we give it lots of data and we give it appropriate data. And that's actually kind of what I'll be talking about for the rest of the talk. How do we get enough data? That's very hard. And how do we make sure these data are appropriate? So the next question is, how many weights did my toy example have? Now, hopefully, to make your lives a bit easier, Em has a multiple choice poll here for you.
Yep, so you've got choices of 4, 8, 20 and 96. So if you don't see the poll, then pop any answer in the chat. Okay, so far most people are going for 20. We've got a couple of people going for 8, one person for 96, one person for 4, but 20 is pulling ahead.
Right, that's really interesting. We've actually got 96. Because look at this image here. Remember, each perceptron has a separate weight for each of its inputs. So each of the lines on this diagram here has an associated weight. And this is often really surprising because we have loads of weights, far more of these parameters, these weights, than you'd ever think. A real non-toy deep neural network probably has hundreds of millions of weights we can change.
Someone's asked about the nodes. Is the weight of each node calculated to prioritize each node? I'm not sure that I understand that, but I'm hoping you.
Now, it is perfectly possible to hand tune these weights. So yes, you can do it, that you're actually tweaking these to get exactly the results you want. Usually, we don't actually understand what the neural network is doing. And as such, no, we just automatically tweak them based on the input data. So you set your weights randomly, you show it an image, see what it does. You then change the weights a little bit, show it the image, see if it does any better. If it does better, you use the new weights. It's really basic. Right. So what happens if we give it data it's not seen? I think we'll skip that question because that's the answer we'll be talking about. So sorry, Em, we're gonna skip that one. Right, so I've given you a very, very brief overview of what a neural network is. It's quite simply this connection of perceptrons that use this flow of weighted information to get some outputs, make some predictions. They're everywhere. We use them in cancer diagnosis. You use them in self-driving cars, in image classification, in who gets which treatment when you go to a clinic. Seriously, they're everywhere. Right, so now I just want you to think about these two questions. How can we trust any model that we've made? We've got bazillions of weights we can tweak, and we don't know what each one does. But we're relying on these neural networks to give us the right cancer drugs, to define our treatment, to drive our cars, and it transpires to run our power grids and everything. How do we do this?
So if you've got any ideas, yeah, pop them in the chat and I'll read out any ideas for this.
Right, I shall, oh, good, we have some.
Yeah, so we have multiple validations. So I guess doing it lots and lots. The more data that goes in, the better the deep neural network becomes.
Very true. Very true.
A couple of nice ideas in more of a practical setting for cancer. Yep. So testing through clinical trials, I guess, is a good way of seeing if it lines up with real life data. Doing a double-blind trial, which would be even better because you're, that sort of how do you trust the scientist? You're removing some of that personal bias.
And yes, lots of data. That's a really good point. And yes, we have to see if it gets its predictions correct. We'll come back to that in a moment. Right, so at this point, I now want to outline 5 ethical considerations to do with data and this input data, because it's critical. And we'll just have a little think about each one. The first point is ubiquitously important in all of this. It's anonymity. So we need all of these data about a patient before we can make a valued judgment on if they've got cancer or not. But at the same time, patient confidentiality, patient anonymity is really important. So we have to think about how we combine these data. For example, loads of people will say, well, the year and month of your birth isn't identifiable. Okay, fine. So I was born in May 1980. Does that identify me? Well, no. Does it tell you a little bit about me? Yes. So for me, this is all fine and good. If I was born in January 1903 and I am still alive, how about that? Does that identify you?
I've got a poll for this one, so I've popped this up and we'll see if people think this is still anonymous data. Interesting. We've got a bit of a split. Yes is winning by quite a margin, but we have got some for no's.
Yeah, and this, again, I find this a little bit freaky. Yes, it's her. There's only one person alive in the world who was born in January 1903. So just those 2 innocuous pieces of information uniquely identify, I'm afraid I can't remember her first name, but this uniquely identifies her. And so we have to be really careful. Individual pieces of information. Are you alive or dead? What's your month of birth? What's your date of birth? Each one of those individually, no problem. Stick the 3 together and your outliers become highly identifiable. Big problem, maybe. Again, I'd like to skip this for time.
Yep.
Please have a think about any other examples directly relevant to cancer research you could think of that might worry you as much or worry you even more. Right. So now we know we have to be careful of our data, but we also have to be very careful of what we put in. So that link there down at the bottom is a classifier. It's a deep neural network. It takes images of X-rays. So these are X-rays of people's lungs, and it tells you if they're normal or have pneumonia. Very similar classifiers are used to look for lung tumors. Very similar classifiers are very frequently used to look for breast tumors. So you put in an image, it tells you back what probability is this normal versus what probability is this, in this case, pneumonia. So there is a pneumonia sample, there is a normal sample. Now here are three images. The top image there, very normal. Good. The bottom image, very pneumonia. Good. I'm trusting this, am I? Have a look at those three images. The image in the middle is the image in the top, rotated 5 degrees. The image at the bottom is the image at the top, rotated 10 degrees. So I have completely changed the result that this neural network has given me by slightly altering the position in which the patient was standing when they had their chest X-ray taken. Ow. Now this is trained with 4,000 images. It was then validated with 1,000 extra images, and it was tested on 624 images. But if we give it something that it wasn't tested against, everything goes wrong. And just to throw it off even more, I gave it that image. And yeah, he's pneumonia. So your next question, and again, there's no real answer here. There is an image of a child. So this is a juvenile chest X-ray. It's saying 86% pneumonia. Should I believe it? And if I should believe it, why? And if I shouldn't, how can we build that trust? Because we need to be able to trust these classifiers. How can I?
So someone said that you could try and validate it using sort of other tests and trials for pneumonia
correct.
that we do know. Checking with the child's medical condition, using a combination of the neural network and a professional opinion.
That's a very good point, that, yes. Yeah. In isolation, any of these individual tools are sus.
And then someone's got a really good idea of asking whether the neural network was built with children's data and whether it can take into account the age. And someone else put, it depends if the neural network was tested with children's data to start with.
Exactly. So these are really, really good points. We've got to not only provide the tool, but we've also got to provide some way of saying, look, this set of inputs is okay. We've tested on this. This other set of inputs, it's beyond the scope of this tool, won't work. Right. Now, this actually is from Cancer directly. This is a tool you can use on the Texas hospital, the MD Anderson Hospital. It calculates your risk of dying from rectal cancer. I ran it twice. I invented a patient, and the patient on the left and the patient on the right are identical, apart from the patient on the left is white and the patient on the right is black. You will see the white gentleman has a disease-specific survival after 9 years of 7%. Bad prognosis. However, if he was black, we've cut that in half to 4%. This is odd. Two questions here. First of all, this is a tool used in current medical practice. Yes, there is a big disclaimer on it. No, I'll change that. There is a tiny disclaimer in a diddy little font saying don't use this on its own. But this is currently influencing whether or not you get treatment. First of all, is that prediction correct? Do you think white people have less of a risk of dying of rectal cancer than black people? Is that right? And if it is right, what's it telling us?
Someone's put it's probably not correct. The input data was probably hugely biased by the health inequalities between races in the States. Someone put not necessarily, it might just be the medical history of the patient that was previously looked at. Someone said that white people might have a better lifespan due to social causes rather than...
And these are all very good points. But the horrible thing is, it's probably right. But it's absolutely nothing to do with biology. It's because of, as you're saying in the chat, these are social factors. And this is therefore horribly cyclic. You get a lower score from the neural network, so you're less likely to get treatment, so you're more likely to die. So that data goes into the neural network. So the neural network's going to give you an even lower score, so you're more likely to die. This is actually happening. It's a huge problem in criminal justice because neural networks are actually used to decide quite a lot of judgments in the courts in America, and they have this problem as well. It's horrible, but we have to think about it. The neural network is not wrong. The neural network is completely correct, but should we be giving it these data? I don't think we should, but that's a personal view. We'll move on. Now, quite obviously from this first slide, this is not a cancer example. That's a stop sign. So there is a state-of-the-art in 2017, so this is a little bit out of date, neural network that recognizes street signs and tells a self-driving car what to do. And the Lisa CNN sees that as a stop sign 100% of the time. And it sees that as a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit sign no % of the time. Clever researchers at MIT, I think, came up with this stop sign. 86% of the time, that neural network will see that as a 45-mile-an-hour probably speed up sign. You can see what they've done. They've very carefully made an image that the neural network, as it has been trained, will see as a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit sign. You can kind of see the ghost of a 5 in the image they've made. This is called adversarial classification. They're not changing the neural network. They are fibbing about the inputs to get the result they want. There's another example, less impressive, but again, you might see that stop sign in the street. Now, imagine that this, which is a real phenomenon, is not self-driving cars and street signs. Imagine this is you going to your doctor and deciding what drugs you'll be given. Do you think that's a problem? I think this is quite a big problem. Now, as you can tell from the example I've picked out, there are no documented examples I could find in medical science yet. But I don't want to wait for that. Eleanor points out again, yes, you could really easily start playing with this to make your drug look better. You could really easily start playing the postcode lottery to get the treatment you wanted. You could invent your medical history. All of these things are possible. I'm running out of time, so I am going to speed up.
No, you're absolutely fine for time.
Oh, great. I'm not going to then.
Don't worry too much.
Right. So now we've seen that we've got to be really careful because the networks are very fragile to input data. We've also seen that we've got huge problems with implicit bias in our data. If the networks are learning other features that aren't medical, that's a big problem. We've just seen you can actually feed them false data to get the results you want. This poor chap, I saw this tweet. This is not malicious, but it's still wrong. I'll give you a moment to read that if you haven't already. You probably saw this in the news. If your height is registered on your GP's record as 6.2 centimeters, you have quite a large BMI. You are registered as morbidly obese, and you will get some weird treatment options appearing. This is a silly example. It's a real example, but it's a silly example. You can imagine that your real medical data are an awful lot more complex. If you go to your GP and you ask to see your medical records, which you are allowed to do, it will take a long time and you will see that they are big. There is a lot of paperwork on you. There's a lot of information in there which is being used to classify you, both for good and for ill. You've got very little input into which of those pieces of data are right and which are wrong. That's a problem. Maybe it's not. Maybe you don't worry. I think it's a problem. Now, I want you to have a think about this. We've just had a whistle-stop tour of 5 issues. We've talked about anonymity. We've talked about fragility to data. We've talked about implicit bias. We've talked about adversarially creating data to give you the results you want. And we've talked very briefly about just typos, just mistakes in your medical record, giving you very different treatment outcomes. I want you to think back to what you thought at the first questions. Do you see any ethical problems here? And just think, do you worry about any of these problems? If so, how do we address them? And I would say, I don't think there are any good answers yet to my second and third questions there. I don't think there are answers in how we protect ourselves. I don't think there is a way we can address these. But I'd like to just throw the floor open to you guys and see what you think.
Awesome, thanks so much. There's been a couple of questions that I'm going to try and pull through.
Yep.
So one person said that they've heard of machine learning being used to look at, they think it was cancer, but something biological, and they actually worked out that the imaging software was actually using a ruler in the photos rather than the actual cells, because the training data has measurements of the cancer tumors. So how could you guard against something like that? Like
it's very difficult.
Up on the wrong thing.
Yeah, and you're completely right. There's loads of examples of the software, if you will, being too smart and thinking outside the box. And it's something we have to be very careful about, because it will learn. It probably won't learn what we think it's learning. And again, we've got to be really careful in how we clean our data, in making sure that we get the right inputs, that the inputs are clean, are similar. There's quite a few other examples of that. Facebook only trained its friend finding image recognition on young Caucasian males. And so it could only recognize young white boys and young white men as people. You'd think they might have done better than that. They're a big organization and they still failed outrageously at it. Loads of examples.
Someone's also asked, they've not seen it being used, sort of machine learning in general, but in healthcare, I'm presuming, being used in other countries as as much as in Europe and America. Do you know if it's how widely it's being used? Do you know if there's sort of different governments that have different preferences for it?
An awful lot of countries are going this way. Mainly because as populations increase, we have to move away from a very manual process, because that's really slow. We are at a huge advantage, ho ho, in Europe and America, because we've already had huge efforts to digitize our patient health records. Of course, you cannot use computational techniques if your data are in a great big foolscap folder written on paper in handwriting. So a vast amount of work has already happened in Britain, Europe, and America to digitize these data. And that gives us here a much greater head start in this, but it's becoming ubiquitous very quickly across the whole world.
Sounds like other places might have a better chance to think through some of the questions before implementing it then.
Yeah.
So someone suggested sort of I think an idea to the questions you've put on the slide, of saying that you could have intelligent multidisciplinary scrutiny panels to look at ethical issues or potential problems for each thing.
I should point out that the MRC is thinking exactly along those lines. So yes, this is coming, and I think it will be an important thing, and a very good point there. Yes.
Just seeing what else we've had come through. Yeah, someone said that their Facebook keeps thinking that their family was hanging out with their twin sister because it couldn't tell the difference between the two of them. I imagine that's a bigger issue for twins than for most people, but a problem nonetheless.
And a nice little thing that someone in my family pointed out is the Photos app on your Mac is perfectly able to learn the difference in faces between different dogs if you've taken enough photos of your dog. So sometimes it works in your advantage.
Yeah, it just shames the Facebook one even more than if it can tell the difference between different dogs and not different people. If anyone's got any other questions about anything Alastair's touched on today, or about how he got into the field, pop them into the chat box or the Q&A. Someone put that their Mac thought that she was their father. So yeah, not worry.
Yeah, more data. That's what you need.
Someone said, what can be a probable ideal amount of data to train a neural network? I'm guessing there's probably not a concrete answer.
There isn't a concrete answer. I have sat through a very boring talk by Google when they were attempting, as you can imagine they would want to do, to classify images on the internet for a number of reasons. And if you have an image that's, call it 150 pixels square, to get a good classification, they said you need about 10 to the 9 images. Think about that. That's 1 billion images for a little square like that. So the answer is more than we've got. Almost always more than we've got. Now, it's not as bad as that. There's loads of research, which is, I can see Eleanor has said again, okay, how do we make this better? There's loads of research in saying, well, actually don't give all of this image to the neural network because it doesn't have a hope. So we do this thing called feature selection, which is we use something which is perfectly understandable, perfectly, if you will, handcrafted, not a neural network, to select many fewer elements from the input data that you then learn on. Don't give it all 16,000 genes. Go through and give it those 100 genes we know are really important in cancer. Because then suddenly you don't have 16,000 times however many weights. You've got 100 times however many weights. So we can hugely reduce the problem space, as we call it, by being sensible in what we put in. And I think the age of shovel all this data in, it's wonderful, we've got all this data, so obviously our problems are solved. we've learned that's not the case. We now have to be very careful and selective about what data we put in, how we choose that data, and how we, what we call, curate that data, how we make sure those data are correct before we start the learning process.
Awesome. I think that speaks to a lot of people were saying earlier, that there needs to be a balance between using this because obviously it speeds up decision making, but also not only relying on it. And I think, having people before and after the neural network sounds like the sort of the best way of doing it.
Yeah. Great.
So someone's posted an interesting idea around the photo thing. So if the government asked everyone to post a photo every day, you'd have 7 million photos. So that might solve the data issue. But then there's a whole other bunch of ethical issues about asking everyone.
And this is the thing. And first of all, I really like that kind of idea, because you can do an awful lot by collecting big, clean data. We've got this wonderful collection of images available, medical images. But if we ask people and we explain why we're doing it and explain the utility of it, maybe we can improve these. And that's the underlying idea in an awful lot of medical trials these days. You go into hospital with a particular condition. Your condition may not be rare, but you may still be asked to join up to a trial so that the clinicians, the doctors, can get high quality data from you, parameterize you, learn about you in an anonymous way, please. Thank you very much. So that we can train these models better. So yes, that's a great idea, but we've got to be so careful in how we do it.
Someone else has asked, and it's sort of linking to that sort of idea of bias in putting stuff in. So how can we make sure that training data takes into account any possibility without being biased? Is there a way to do that?
I think you're thinking along the right questions. I don't know. And we are, as a society, going to have to address these. I think the short answer, personally, is no. We have to treat anonymity, for example, not as yes or no, but as a sliding scale. And where are we prepared to draw the line? That may be different for different people. It's certainly different in different cultures around the world. So it's a very nuanced question. If you give no data away, you get no sensible diagnosis back. If you completely lie to your doctor, they're not going to give you a sensible diagnosis. If you give all of your data away, you'll get a good diagnosis, but you might get loads of downsides as well. So somewhere in the middle is this line. How do we decide where that line is? And how do we allow people to have different ideas on that is a very difficult question.
Someone's put a slightly different sort of themed question, asking, would it be possible for your, especially in the Western countries, for your medical data to get hacked and to be sort of used in some sort of bad way?
Yes, and it's already happening quite regularly. Be very wary of doing something like 23andMe and putting all your genotype information in a private company. Yes, there are quite a few examples of medical data being run off with, if you will. Currently, there's not very much that people are doing with it. Doesn't actually matter as yet, because we don't have the tools to correctly classify people based on this data. When we do, those data are going to become far more valuable. Your insurance company really wants to know if you're being a naughty, dangerous person and doing lots of risky things like smoking and drinking. And your insurance premiums will go up if you do, if you tell them. If your data become public domain because they're hacked, well, that probably counts as telling your insurance company. Insurance companies already do Google searches of you automatically. They already look at your social media to decide if they think you're being risky, and that will impact your premiums. So if these medical data do become public domain, they will probably impact you.
Awesome.
Any other thoughts? Any other questions?
Seeing as we've got 10 minutes, I know that you do have a couple extra slides.
Yes,
I wonder if you wanted to go on to those.
So far, I've talked about concrete examples where, okay, not very concrete really, where we know what we're trying to get the computer to do. So I want you to have a little look at this very famous optical illusion. Okay, so I know the answer to this, but are the squares A and B on your screen the same color? I bet, even if you've done this before, I bet that they aren't, because they're not for me. So I know this. I've done it.
We've got a mix of yes and no in the chat box so far.
I'm going to fast forward a slide and then we'll come back again. They are the same color. I'm not lying to you. Print it out and stick them together. They're the same color, honest gov. So the problem here is that human brains don't work sensibly always. We are doing so many more things to this image than just saying, are A and B the same color? Well, I know what the colors on a chessboard are. They go black, white, black, white, black, white. So I know that A and B must be different colors because they're on a chessboard and their knights move away from each other. I already know that. So I'm actually going to disbelieve what my eyes tell me because I know it's a chessboard. Furthermore, there's this cylinder here that's casting a shadow. So I know that there's a shadow there. So my brain is actually lightening the things in the perceived shadow. So my brain is, if you will, lying to me. Wrong word. My brain is interpreting the data I see based on my lived experience, based on what I already know of the world. So here's a question. Should we be teaching our neural networks to look at that data and say, A and B are the same color, thank you very much, I'm off? Or should we be teaching them to think like we think? Because we're going to get very different answers. Think back to the example I gave you from MD Anderson of the two hypothetical people with rectal cancer. Well, the neural network looked at those two and it said, they're different. Because they are, because the data are. But if we apply our knowledge as you did previously and said, well, no, there's implicit bias here, you get a different answer. So we need to be thinking not only about the technology, how do we use these data, but how do we interpret the results we get? Are we just looking for the computer to give us black and white truth? Or are we looking to try and teach the computer human concepts in diagnosis? And if so, how? There's really no right answer here.
Someone's agreed with you and said that we need to teach computers something like this, with an example of the road signs that needs to be able to take into account the context. And they followed up by saying, we don't always recognize implicit bias. And that's
very good point. Very good point. Okay, the example I gave was kind of explicit bias, really, isn't it? But your point is very, very true. We probably don't have any idea all of the subtleties of the data we're trying to learn on. And we will find lots more of them as we go.
So someone's asked, are computers better at spotting biases than us?
Ooh, that's a really fun point. Yes, I bet in many ways they are. But the trouble is we only see this when they pop out as weird, unexpected, and kind of socially uncomfortable results. So I think maybe
I've seen an example where someone ran a machine learning on all of their application process to see if the application process was biased. And they found that the machine was picking up words like women's college and women's society and taking points off an application. And that essentially highlighted that they were biased against women, which wasn't obviously an explicit bias in their process, but the machine had picked it up. So I think if you use it to spot a bias, it probably can.
Yeah. I see someone saying, yeah, we need humans in the loop. And that's very much my feeling. The more I spend researching machine learning, the more I don't want to hand all the control to the computers. They're both too good and far too stupid at the same time and in the same sentence. So yeah, I think that point's quite right, that we need to know for sure what we're learning. We need to be sensible about how we're doing that.
I'm aware that we're coming up nearly to past, so I think to wrap up, I'll ask if you've got any advice. If anyone in the audience has found this really interesting and maybe wants to look into this further, what would you suggest to anyone at sort of GCSE or A level? Any subjects that you think are really useful and any resources that you'd point to?
You're gonna hate me for saying this, guys. This is maths. It's all maths. Most of this, it's just adding up. It's simple maths underneath. But if you want a career in this, you are going to have to, at one level, understand the mathematics. Now, don't be put off by that, because the maths are actually much more simple than you think. And I hope, you can pass around a few links that I've got. There are a couple of YouTube channels that go over this in a fun way. But if you do want to dig into this, you can go a lot worse than teach yourself a programming language called Python. There is a huge amount of documentation on this online. It's a dead easy language. If any of you are going on to do computer science degrees, you'll almost certainly be exposed to Python very early on. If you're going on to any other STEM subject, the likelihood is, if you've not already come across it, you will. Python good. Mainly because there is a framework, a set of computational tools written on top of Python called TensorFlow. And that is the de facto standard for building these neural networks. It's really easy to get into. Em has just put a set of links there. Those are brilliant. I use microbit loads. They're great. But if you want to, look through those links, have a look at the YouTube channels that Em will send around about learning maths and a little bit about machine learning and deep neural networks, and scratch your Python skills. It's a really good place to start, and it's much easier than you think.
Someone's just asked, how deep should the maths be done in order to go ahead in machine learning? So I guess what level might they want to look at doing maths?
As much as you want.
The more
There's
the
no right answer there. You can fire these up and you can do this with no maths at all, but you're missing a trick. So if I were you, I would go online and look at the resources and I would start playing. But the one thing I would say is don't be scared of it. Because remember, a perceptron is just a whole load of input times weight plus input times weight plus input times weight. That's it. That's all it is. It's just adding up. And so at one level, you need very little. If you start reading scientific papers in this field, you will find there is a stupid amount of jargon. But Google it, go on Wikipedia. There's loads of blogs of people who make this much more accessible. And you'll realize very quickly it's a lot simpler than you think.
Awesome. That brings
Great.
us perfectly to past. So thank you so much, Alastair, and thank you for everyone coming along tonight. Had some really interesting questions and discussions, and hopefully we'll all go away and think about this much more. As I said at the beginning, we've got one more of these next week, looking at careers in cancer research. If you're thinking about a career in science, then that'll be really interesting to come along to. All of the links that I shared throughout this evening, so about other events, the links that Alastair had around maths and the coding links will all be in the email that you'll get tomorrow from Eventbrite. So don't worry, you won't miss them if you've not grabbed them just now. But yes, thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.